Race, ethnicity, ancestry, bloodlines, identity, pride, shame, heritability, ego stroking, blah blah, fucking blah. All very boring subjects. Terribly boring. And so I tend to not discuss them. But boy, did I ever write a long-ass post, half of which dealt with ethnicity. And I wrote that a day or so before the Charlottesville incident happens. So, fascinating timing. But, nonetheless, the subject is the sort of thing that I don't want to do videos about because there's a lot of layers to it, so it's hard to nail all those layers in these extemporaneous videos. So I wrote about it at length. And then Charlottesville happens, and I find myself wanting to write more about ethnicity, more about pride, shame, whether it's ever misplaced, whether it can ever truly be misplaced, either of the two. Just how much of a role should group identity have for an intellectual, let's say? And is it fair-minded of an intellectual to try to dissuade a non-intellectual, the conventionalist, to take their view? More often than not, the intellectual will say, well, no, neither pride nor shame should have anything to do with the group you belong to, no matter which group. These are topics that I can actually write about forever, even though at the end of the day, I tell myself that I don't find the topics in and of themselves fascinating at all. And boring, like I said at the start. I do think they're boring, but I think what does make them halfway worthy of being written about is how everyone else deals with the topics. And I do mean everyone else. Now, of course, I don't watch all the videos that get made on this site. I probably only watch about 5% of the videos that get made on this site. They're made by intellectuals and assorted intellectual hipsters who think of themselves as intellectuals. But of those 5 or 10% of the videos I do see, no one hits the sweet spot on the topics of groupism, identitarianism, genetic collectivism, and, loop in race and ethnicity. And so because I'm not seeing anyone hit the sweet spot, I'm not content to just write about this. I'm going to try to vlog about it as well. Of course, I'm not going to hit all the subtleties in a video, so if you want the full scoop, feel free to head on over to my post and read the whole thing. So, Charlottesville. Chaos. Violence. Should we smash fascism as opposed to trying to debate fascism? I guess that's one of the questions being circulated. And who the fuck knows? I am psychologically inclined to want to say that anything that gives an individual with sloppy views the notion, anything that reinforces their notion that their ideas are sound to the point where their opponents don't want to debate them and instead feel the need to smash them, that's very irritating. I'm almost tempted to say that I don't care about any other consequence except that. Like, I don't want to see a certain type of person have such views reinforced. That their stance on an issue is infallible. So infallible to the point where individuals feel the need to resort to violence so as to not debate them. That's just infinitely irritating to me because the views are very flimsy. And of course, when I say something like fascism, I'm referring to hard identitarianism. There's a host of soft identitarianisms and a bunch of stuff in the middle. Nativism, for instance, is an example of a soft identitarian governance model. Expansionistic nationalisms, I guess we can always call those hard identitarianisms. But of course, not all ethno-nationalists are expansionistic nationalists. Many of them are genuinely isolationistic. They do genuinely want to isolate. And the anti-racists' refusal to entertain this as a possibility, the possibility of race-obsessed individuals who truly do not give a fuck about ethnic cleansing or in some way exterminating the outgroup. That's all too feasible. And the unwillingness to grant that those types of people do exist, and it's a rampant unwillingness among the modern anti-racist movement. Right? There's just constant equivocation between expansionistic nationalisms and isolationistic nationalisms. It's flimsy as fuck. It's the equivalent of McCarthyite approaches to anti-capitalist economics, where there's no degree of separation between the socialist and the communist. There's no such thing as a market socialist. All socialists believe in central planning. The moment you go down anything that even remotely reeks of anti-capitalism, it'll result in mass starvation, gulags, and things of that sort. Technocratic brainwashing, blah, blah, blah. Right? So what that is that's cognitive ease, as opposed to cognitive strain. One-dimensionalize your opposition. Then it's easier to argue. Happens when it comes to unorthodox economic models. Happens when it comes to unorthodox views on race relations. Pretty much discontinuing race relations. Make it so that there's no such thing as a race relation. I want to steel man every last position. Which is not to say that the weak man is a straw man, per se, but it's by no means the best possible argument you can seek out. And we should seek out the best possible argument, because right now, one of the reasons the discourse is impossible, and one of the reasons for why tensions are at a fever pitch, is because everyone's looking to weak man. No one's looking to steel man the opposition. Well, how do you steel man the opposition? Well, you go after an isolationistic nationalism. Of course, that requires us to discuss, well, what are the bedrocks of, let's say, for example, the most trendy type of ethno-nationalism going right now, white nationalism. What are the bedrocks of white nationalism? Well, number one, there's the descriptive view, which is race realism. And then there's the more prescriptive supplement in the form of ethical egoism. And maybe ethical egoism in cahoots with social Darwinism. Though social Darwinism doesn't have to come along for the ride, it's just I tend to think these sort of individuals like to have it come along for the ride. So then, what should anti-racists really fixate on? They want to undermine these arguments, and undermine them for good. Should they fixate on stuff like race realism? Stuff like hereditarianism? Right? Should that really be a goal? Well, I guess if you're trying to preserve critical race theory, then race realism does have to be a goal. You have to go after the descriptive, not merely the prescriptive. Because then these complaints about who's underrepresented in which field and who's overrepresented in which field, they become pivotal if you buy into critical race theory, which of course says that white supremacy sustains itself over time in subtle and maybe not so subtle ways. So I am not looking to preserve critical race theory. I think it is intellectual cancer, just as intersectionality is intellectual cancer. And I've written about it at length. You can read the post. So the moment that goes out the window, all you're looking to preserve is impartiality under the law. They call it color blindness. Okay, so then Do we, in any way, shape, or form, need to go after race realism? Absolutely not. The truth and falsity of race realism, whichever it is, first of all, it's not going to be grasped by the overwhelming majority of the public. These are highly complex fields, genetics, biology. I think even if the average person had the mental chops to grasp these things, just the amount of data, the amount of research, the amount of studies they've done, from twin studies all the way to all these other intergroup studies, there's just so much to plow through. I'm confident the average person who might even show an interest in that would not find the time to plow over even 1/10 of it, let alone all of it. That's just the bare minimum essentials. So all you're hoping there is for the ignorance of individuals who are sympathetic to your view that race realism is false, that they get more energized than the ignorant individuals who are more sympathetic to race realism being true. Right? Sort of the battle of the ignorant audiences, and who's got the more massive ignorant audience. It's a recipe for disaster. Right? So, like, everything I'm about to say right now works. Everything, every last bit of it is applicable irrespective of the truth or falsity of race realism. Hereditarianism. Like, even if things like IQ are 100% heritable, not just 80%, but like 100% heritable, everything else that follows still follows. And of course, everything else that I'm saying should follow is the attack on ethical egoism. Without ethical egoism, everything crumbles for the white nationalist or any other ethno-nationalist. Because, well, what does ethical egoism do? Well, usually it's on the individual level, but when the individual egoist really has a concern for their own ethnic group, then, well, it makes perfect sense to broaden it, to broaden the scope of moral concern to all the individuals who encompass that group. So it's sort of grouped egoism, I guess we can call it. And that really is the edifice of white nationalism, and I'd say any other type of nationalistic or separatist movement. It wouldn't make any sense for a non-white to head a white nationalist movement, because it's all about the individual. Without the individual, without that unwillingness to evaluate everything that goes on from an agent-neutral perspective, it all crumbles apart. Right? So it's all agent-centered, and the most robust ethic for agent-centered moral philosophies is ethical egoism. And it's no surprise that many white nationalists are former ANCAPs, former voluntarists, and from what I can see, even former Randians. It's because they had that egoism. It always appealed to them at the individual level, and with time they've just come to broaden it out to the ethnic group level. So the super majority of analytic moral philosophers are not ethical egoists. They're rejected. It's a bunch of other moral systems, and many arguments have been written, debated over the years for why it's flimsy. Prisoner's Dilemma, sort of a basic one, that Derek Parfit wrote about. Even if we set additional arguments to the side, which I don't want to get bogged down on ethical egoism too much because it's just too damn easy to waste video time on, there is a sort of remaining problem for people who want to preserve moral conventionalism and reject egoism, because it never really goes the whole way. Now, does it? Conventional views tend to say that you ought to treat your immediate family members, relatives, close friends, even distant acquaintances, if you can benefit or harm them slightly, let's just say benefit. If you can benefit them slightly, or you can benefit a perfect stranger far more, you should still benefit the individual who's in your life. Because they're in your life, because it's about you. That's what conventionalism is. It's not an agent-neutral ethic. It's still an agent-relative ethic. It's not necessarily egoistic, but it doesn't reject every aspect of egoism. It still sneaks in certain aspects. And you can see how that's ripe for being exploited by white nationalists or any other type of genetic collectivists who specialize in drawing analogies to the ethnic group and the family. Right? So if you're somebody, like a conventionalist watching this, and you believe that there's nothing wrong with giving preferential treatment to family members, even in moral dilemmas, where like you can save one family member from gruesome torture, or you can save like 100 strangers from gruesome torture. And you think it's still more important, morally important, to save the family member because the relationship is what drives the moral feature of the case, and not the raw numbers. That is ripe for exploitation because you can draw these analogies between the family and the ethnic group. These are sound analogies in and of themselves. And the only way the analogies are going to pack last punch is if you say that, well, no, the relationship between the individual and any other individual they might have some sort of sentimentality over, we can acknowledge that sentimentality, but sentimentality doesn't inform prescriptive force. And so the people who are the most invigorated to fight the racism of the white nationalism, there are sort of people who have no problems with these preferential treatments in other contexts. I'm not seeing them renouncing familial ethics, and I'm not seeing them renouncing the idea of human exceptionalism. It's perfectly fine for them, the lion's share of them, to tolerate factory farming insofar as factory farming conveniences the average human. That's another type of exceptionalist-based convenience, and it needs to go. You need to reject the end result of that. You need to reject the beginnings of it. But instead, what we do, the anti-racist does, modern anti-racist does, is talk about how no one is born to hate. I think Obama's tweet that no one's born to hate is the most liked tweet of all time, and that's perceived as being in some way relevant. And you can see how, well, that's a descriptive statement, right? So if someone undermines that statement, do they score a point in favor of separatism on the ethnic level? Like, let's say an individual truly is, like most individuals truly are, every bit as prone to hatred as they are to love. What changes when it comes to impartial concern? Let's say I am a referee, I'm officiating a match, and I truly loathe one team, and I want the other team to win. Let's say the other team consists of fellow Slavs, my Slavic stock, so fellow Slavs. And that's one team. The other team is just like gypsies or something. I'm pretty sure if someone did an implicit bias test on my psychology, yeah, I wouldn't have a favorable view of gypsies. So let's say I was a referee, and I have this negative view of gypsies at the implicit level, and I have a positive view of fellow Slavs, and those are the two teams, just entirely made up of Slavs, and the other one's entirely made up of gypsies. And they're playing soccer or something. It doesn't really matter what they're playing. What fucking difference would it make what I feel, who I'm rooting for? If there's a questionable call, should I, as the official, exploit that so as to make a shoddy call in favor of a team that I emotionally want to see win? No, it would be wrong. It will be wrong according to just about any ethical system, with the exception of ethical egoism. He says I should do what's in my interest. And in my interest, clearly, in my sentimental interest, it would be to see the team that I want to see win, even if it's a shoddy-ass call. No. If something fishy happened, I would just say, do-over. I wouldn't cheat as the referee. And that's essentially what ethical egoism is. It neglects the interests of the outgroup or anyone who's not the individual, insofar as it bolsters the individual. It's not recommended for its own sake. It's only recommended in a dilemma where the individual stands to lose if he does something nice for far more individuals. But that same case of the impartial official doesn't just apply when one team is your ethnic group and the other team is a sort of other ethnic group that you, at the implicit bias level, have been shown to dislike. It's every bit as applicable if you have one team that's just the most favorite people in your life, like the people you love more than anyone else, and the other team consists of individuals you just find irritating. You still have to call it down the middle. There's no way around that. So, whether or not we are born to do this or that is beside the point. Like the fact that Obama's tweet is as popular as it is, most liked tweet of all time, it just shows me how ill-equipped people are to debate this issue. Because I don't have that idyllic view of the human condition. I am very much inclined to believe that we are born with as much capacity to hate others as we are to love those who are like us. But it makes no difference prescriptively. What we are born to think or feel has no bearing on what we ought to do or ought not to do once we've actually thought things through. It pains me to see people gushing over tweets like that. Especially since, if you know anything about cognitive science, they have shown that there's a very thin line between love and hate. It's the irrational features of the brain that light up when we are making these love and hate judgments. As a matter of fact, they've also linked to an article that shows that there's actually a bit more rationality when it comes to the regions of the brain that activate when you're engaging in hateful thoughts, because usually hateful thoughts are accompanied with a plot to do away with the object of your hatred. So you need to scheme more, so it entails more inward rationality than just pure love. Like love and hate are just totally beyond the point. And not only are people gushing over that tweet, but instead of summarizing these separatist groups with a like a one-size-fits-all term like egoism, they use the word hate, as if hatred itself is suggestive of something. I hate a lot of fucking people. They still have moral interests. The fact that I hate them is irrelevant. So, one other point that I do need to mention is that there is all sorts of confusion when it comes to instrumental versus final value. Because there's a certain mawkishness, I think, that pushes people away from impartiality, because impartiality, of course, is just one face of equality. There's many other faces of equality, and anti-racists, I can't really pin the majority of them on this, because I don't get a chance to talk to the majority of them on this, but they strike me as believing tacitly that when it comes to diversity, heterogeneity, like versus homogeneity, that there's something intrinsically good or bad when it comes to these things. Like, whereas I would say it's only ever instrumental. Like, if heterogeneity boosts average welfare of every ethnic group, or even some ethnic groups, then okay, then and only then promulgate heterogeneity. If homogeneity boosts the average or total welfare of some or most ethnic groups, then promulgate homogeneity. These things fluctuate. And I'm not even saying segregate or integrate on the legal level, I'm just saying something like aversive racism, like typically something that people mock rural whites for. Aversive racism is not a moral wrongdoing. Interjection time. I just need to point out that a bit later on in the video I say heterogeneity when I really mean to say homogeneity, and vice versa. So I know homogeneity is sameness, and I know heterogeneity is difference, but in the midst of the video I got it tangled up, so no smart-ass comments. Actually fine, go ahead and make smart-ass comments about it, but just know that I have made amends prior to uploading the video with this clip, so you can't be too much of a smart-ass about it. That's all. There are nonetheless many other wings that have fuck all to do with impartiality, but have equality as a built-in fundamental value. The moment you do that, you can see how it might make sense to equalize mutual understandings. So if perhaps you have a misconception about a given ethnic outgroup that gets bolstered because you engage in what they refer to as aversive racism, it has nothing to do with politicizing or racializing your biases on the political level. It's entirely apolitical. It's how you live your life and who you choose to associate with and who you choose not to associate with. They got a term for it. Aversive racism. There's a certain type of egalitarian who finds that morally bad, the fundamental level, not the instrumental level, but the fundamental level. And that can cause all sorts of other, I would say, moral noise-making. So the signal-to-noise ratio, when you find yourself worried about that sort of stuff, signal-to-noise ratio is heavily skewed toward the noise end. And really, the only wing of impartiality, or sorry, the only wing of equality we ought to concern ourselves with is that of impartiality. I think everything else is pretty much noise. And the aversive racism example clarifies that. Because imagine two states of affairs, two non-overlapping states of affairs. Call them worlds to make it more clear. Right? So the hedonic status, let's say, for both of them is identical. And let's also say the preference satisfaction status for both is identical. Right? Not just in terms of the aggregate or the average, but also distributively. Every single individual, there's an equal amount of individuals qualify as persons, qualify for moral personhood. They all get an identical share of what they want to get. There's zero difference in that respect. The only difference between the two worlds is one is 100% integrated on the aversive racism apolitical level, and one is 100% segregated in accordance to that aversive racism apolitical scrutiny. Now, I can bring one of those two worlds about. Which one would I bring about? I would flip a coin. There's a certain type of egalitarian who would view flipping a coin as morally disastrous because they don't believe in what's called person-affecting views. They also believe in world-affecting views. That something can be good without it necessarily being good for an individual who constitutes a moral patient. Like, the world can be improved, not these constituents within the world, but the world itself. So I don't believe that. I believe all value is value for, and I believe value simpliciter, world-affecting views, like improving the world itself, I believe all of that is just magical thinking. And sort of loops into aesthetic realism, because there's certain axiologists who believe that it's not just about moral value, it's also about aesthetic value, and certain things can improve the world aesthetically. This is really how you get things like I complained about in the last video, the belief that you can extend fundamental, intrinsic moral concern to ecosystems and biospheres, and even species, like not just individuals within species, but species as an abstraction. It's all very poorly argued, in my view. I've written about why at length. You can read that if you have the time. I'm just giving a sort of basic rundown right now in the video. World-affecting views fail, and fail hard. There are only ever person-affecting views. All value is value for. So, the two worlds, if they are identical in terms of hedonic status and preference satisfaction status, the fact that one is entirely segregated and the other is entirely integrated, it's beside the point. It's not relevant in any coherent sense. And there is a certain mawkishness to believing that it is. And I think that sort of mawkishness is going to... that there are certain sacred things about diversity. That diversity is not only ever instrumentally valuable, that it can ever be terminally valuable. That is going to drive potential fence-sitters away, because there are certain psychologically alluring features of racializing or politicizing one's racial preferences. And when that sort of fence-sitter sees how sacred diversity is perceived, values like, homogeneity as opposed to heterogeneity. If you can sense that there are certain individuals who care about these things in and of themselves, it is sort of quasi-religious thinking. And then the fence-sitter is just going to go into overdrive and think that the solution is the polar opposite. It's like not granting a moral status to the outgroup, which takes me back to the sweet spot. You can grant all the outgroups the exact same moral status as you grant the in-group, but despite that, still understand that diversity in and of itself is not a fundamental value. Just like heterogeneity in and of itself is not a fundamental disvalue. So things like aversive racism that are depoliticized, that take place in the private sphere, can never be a subject for moral scrutiny. The closest you can come to scrutinizing those kinds of things is the stuff we see when it comes to resumes. Like you have these surveys that show a individual employer who's reviewing resumes. The two resumes are identical. The only difference is one resume has the name Bob, the other one has the name Jamal. Bob will get calls back far more often than the Jamal resume will. And so, but that takes it beyond headspace. And now we're actually targeting something tangible. When it comes to mere associations on a non-institutional level, when it comes to your post-responsibility life, aversive racism can never be this valuable. This idea that these misconceptions about ethnic outgroups will not get... the only reason those misconceptions get reinforced is because the individual is shunning familiarizing themselves with the outgroups. That's also potentially flimsy on a descriptive level as well. Like if you pick Harlem as a place to familiarize yourself with the ethnic outgroup, and you're a rural white, let's say, yeah, I think that will actually reinforce those negative stereotypical views even more. So, insofar as the aversive racist is not trying to politicize anything, they're not doing anything wrong. And if you actually know your instrumental versus final value delineations, you're not going to have any fucking problem with that argument. But instead, what a lot of modern anti-racists do is they look at all these lines I'm trying to draw and they view it as pedantry. Like, I'm just being pedantic with all this, right? So what it is it's a failure to think slow. Like, there's these fast and slow thoughts, deliberative and impulsive thoughts, and there's a great book that's written about it. It's actually called Thinking Fast and Slow. I'll link to it. The whole audiobook is available on YouTube. And that's what I always see when people start to accuse someone like me right now of being just overly pedantic or being a useful idiot for neo-Nazis by making these points. Because it's perceived as, well, I'm just opening the Pandora's box to the worst case scenario. And the worst case scenario would never happen if you just didn't open up the Pandora's box. But no one ever truly explains in any sort of reasoned detail how these delineations between instrumental and final value can lead to that. I actually think the opposite is true. I think trying to muddy the waters, trying to present diversity as something that can improve the world without necessarily improving the hedonic status of a single individual or the preference set of a single individual. Like, if no preference is ever frustrated as a result of the absence of diversity, the absence of diversity doesn't make anything worse. You cannot worsen or improve the world. You can only do so with the constituents within the world, made up of persons. Really shouldn't be that difficult to explain. And the fact that I get accused of being a pedant when I try to explain it, that just shows how far we have to go when it comes to mainstream discourse. Because this is me engaging in the trenches of the mainstream discourse when I tackle these subjects. And there's just such a huge chasm on the communicational level. People are just so impulsive when they think, unless you go from A to Z with them, unless you march in lockstep with them on the procedure, the anti-racist procedure, they will try to think, they will assume, to one degree or another, that you're harboring malicious motives. Just like they will with any individual who accepts race realism. Like Sam Harris had Charles Murray on. I don't think I need to tell anyone about that and how people insist that Murray, a guy who favors universal basic income, not just for whites, but for all non-whites as well. Now he wants to gradually implement it, but that's still something. It's still far more than what a bunch of individuals who share his political ideology, but who are not race realists, right? Who are far more antagonistic toward redistribution. Here's a guy who's totally fine with redistribution via UBI, and yet they think he is more malicious simply because of his descriptive views on something that can be categorized as race realism. I mean, it is so spurious, the line of reasoning that takes place within the anti-racist mindset. Beyond the pale. It's so disappointing to see such impulsive thinking. So I'm going to wrap this up by pointing out a few potential additional objections to giving the average white nationalist a sort of sovereign nation state that have nothing to do with race per se, and that have to do with a... see, it's tentative because I haven't done the like all my data is anecdotal data because of exposure to these people, but I haven't seen any sort of surveys that show that certain other views come along for the ride more often than not when you believe in heterogeneity being an intrinsic moral good. But these are some of the ones that I've jotted down just now. So I believe that there would be zero or nominal child protective services agencies when it comes to assisting minors from their awful parents. Like if we let these people have their own entirely sovereign nation state, I just don't see them having child protective services. Why? Well, the revamping of disciplinarianism and other do-as-I-say, no questions asked forms of parental entitlement that come along for the ride. I consider this a likely possibility because white nationalists are utterly obsessed with bloodlines. As such, they are the very people who on average believe that one's child is merely an extension of oneself, or is even the parent's property. And when you have that sort of mindset running rampant, it's just hard to believe that the minority of the individuals who inhabit that same society would be able to push through a political agenda in the way of CPS. What else do I have here? I wrote, there would probably be more closeted gay/lesbian/bisexuals. There is much overlap between white nationalism, from what I've seen anecdotally. There's much overlap between white nationalism and degeneracy concern. These are tradcons who actually believe that what disgusts them on a psychological level is intrinsically immoral or axiologically bad. So again, this is a tentative argument because I haven't seen any surveys showing that there are these associations between A and B, but when I'm just observing them anecdotally, it's definitely there. The association is the elephant in the room. An additional one I wrote, no regulations on factory farming, and possibly nothing in the way of animal cruelty laws either. When you find it easy to rationalize around non-whites having a moral status, odds are you'll find it all the more easy to rationalize a way around non-human animals having a moral status. Yeah, I think that goes without saying. So giving them a sovereign state with no other oversight will probably be disastrous for the animals that are born in those societies, just like it'll be disastrous for a good number of minors who will be born to those societies. And then finally I wrote retributivism in the punitive system. So I really find it hard to believe that a individual who accepts metaphysical determinism, causality, would in any way be represented in a ethno-state. This is because when you grasp determinism, something like egoism becomes a lot more hard to rationalize. And egoism is, of course, the bedrock of their philosophy. You become so aware that everything that we are recipients of is, at bottom, fortune and misfortune. We didn't encode our brain. There is no such thing as equality of opportunity, even when there is equality under the law, because any robust understanding of equality of opportunity entails the equalization of undeserved life prospects. And when you're a determinist, like, everything that you have is undeserved because you didn't choose it, because it was a product of causality. So I think negative liberty at the group level, like the out-group, has no claim on the in-group when it comes to assistance of any sort. I think the same sort of gears that get people to conclude that that is moral, that the positive obligations toward out-groups are morally unjustifiable, I just don't see how that is possible within a deterministic framework. You have to be a proponent of some sort of metaphysical libertarianism, aka free will. And with that comes a higher likelihood of revamping retributivist policies. So rewards and punishments are not good instrumentally. Rewards and punishments are good in a final sense. And yeah, if I can put a leash on individuals congregating who will bolster that kind of ethic, I'll fucking put a leash on them. So there's a lot of these other issues that don't necessarily have anything to do with race, that simply have to do with allowing individuals who have these, I'd say, borderline medieval ethical views from getting their own little hunk of land where no one can interfere with what they do. Another add-on, just quickly, I suppose you can look at what I did earlier with the two worlds hypothetical, one of my hypothetical things that I do, and you can say, well, point taken, but it's a completely worthless hypothetical because there's no way to have the split worlds and have the preference set, the status of the preferences or the status of welfare in general be the same if there is a bunch of aversive racism in one world and zero aversive racism in the other world. So my point about diversity being completely instrumental and never intrinsic is a hollow point because it still is, in reality, instrumental. So it's a worthless thought experiment. And I would say it's not completely worthless because at least if you grant that diversity is never intrinsic, then diversity is just another one of these things that is up to be bargained. And it can't be bargained away completely as a cost-benefit, just like anything else can, insofar as there is less of an aggregate preference for diversity and maybe more of an aggregate preference for the absence of diversity. So that was the point of the two worlds, is the moment you recognize that diversity is not important at the fundamental level, then it's no longer sacrosanct. And I think there's some percent, I don't know what percent it is, but there's a percentage of modern anti-racists who would be inclined to disagree with that and who would insist that it's important for its own sake. And so I think it can be bargained away, and if there's enough of a hostility toward diversity in real time, then diversity is as useless as any other dogmatic value is. It's just something to bludgeon individuals over the head with. And I think the best case scenario would be the anti-racists, what they really fear is not the absence of diversity, but the manner in which certain host populations might go about getting rid of the diversity. And then we're back to things like ethnic cleansing, and that, of course, would be a completely legitimate fear. But absent that fear, if we get a guarantee that there will be no ethnic cleansing, we'll be rid of diversity without any ethnic cleansing and without the worsening of a single individual's welfare, fearing the absence of diversity is kind of like fearing the devil, in my view. So, yeah, if we have a world, if you can show me that the world today, the supermajority of human beings have a preference for diversity, I'll be the first to point out that my thought experiment is worthless. If you can show that it's only a relative majority that has a preference for diversity, and there's another relative, almost majority, that has the preference for an absence of diversity, then there's a real argument to be had here. Whose preferences do we cater to? Keeping in mind that